So here's the concept with the analogy or the story that you're using with the patient education, okay? So remember on day 2, and remember, how important is a story? The story is more important than data. It's more important than this or this. Over time in humanity, how is information passed? Stories. We remember stories. Do not underestimate the power of a story. The story is the most important. And what kind of story? A simple story. A simple story they can relate to. The story. They go back and tell their spouse or significant other. You think they're going to tell them this stuff? Or do you think they're going to say something about a mop and arthritis and concrete and a permanent injury? You see, that story is very important, okay? So learn how to say the story very simply. A lot of doctors have trouble with the story. They just go on and on. They just, a ton of words to say something. And here's what you want to do. You want to be able to say the story in 3 sentences. And here's the concept. What's the first sentence? The first sentence is the parallel. Like in the example here, it's the strands of the mop as it relates to the scar tissue. That's the parallel. Okay, that's one. So let's draw the comparison. That's the first sentence. Draw the comparison between the strands on the mop and the scar tissue. Same with over here. Here's concrete and permanent, right? We're going to draw a parallel between the scar tissue and wet concrete. That's the parallel for the first sentence. Okay? Let's come back over here. What's the concept for the sentence? Therapy. How therapy will affect that. That's the therapy. How does therapy relate to the mop as it relates to scar tissue? That's the second sentence. Over here, how does therapy relate to scar tissue and the concrete? That's the second sentence. Therapy. What's the third sentence? The third sentence third sentence is the pain-based component. What happens if it doesn't? What happens if it doesn't? That's the third component. And actually it's pleasure pain. This is how we can prevent it, is the good news. The bad news is if we don't, it's the analogy of this. It's pleasure and pain. So it's how your therapy is going to help solve the problem, or the problem is going to be permanent. It's one or the other. It's pleasure, pain. Same over here, concrete. It's going to be pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain. So as an example, what would I say here as a first sentence? An example would be like this. So as an example, John, as a simple example, the scar tissue, if you think of the scar tissue, is like the strands of a mop. If you drop the mop down, all the strands are tangled. I'm going to call that the first sentence. I'm comparing the scar tissue to the tangled strands of a mop. Second sentence. Therapy. The goal of the therapy is a simple example is like if we took the mop and we twisted it. When we twist it, all those strands start to line up. That's what happens to the scar tissue. Instead of the scar tissue being random, it starts to line up. The bad news is if it remains tangled, that's the #1 cause of arthritis. The bad news is when the concrete and when the scar is if the injury heals permanently wrong, if the injury heals outside of the time frame, just like concrete, there's a certain time frame before that concrete solidifies and you can't do anything with it anymore. That's exactly what happens with the scar tissue. There's a time frame we can work with the scar tissue. After that, if it heals wrong, that's why you'll have a permanent injury. You see how simple we just made the story? Mm-hmm. So what would it sound like in total here? Let me share with you, Jim, the simple story. I'm thinking just 3 sentences. The example is kind of like a mop. Let me share a simple story with Jim of how the scar tissue is kind of like the strands of a mop. In that when you drop a mop on the floor, all those strands become mixed. That was my first sentence. Second sentence, therapy-based. The goal of the therapy, Jim, is similar to like if we were to pick the mop up and turn it, all of those strands would start to get into a line. That's exactly what happens with the treatment. It's designed to help to align those strands of the scar tissue. That was the second sentence. Last sentence, pleasure, pain. The good news is if that scar tissue, or excuse me, if those strands get aligned, that's when it'll get back to normal. The bad news is if those strands do not go back into a line, that's the #1 cause of arthritis. That's how that would have been said. Now come over here. Let me give you a simple story of how the scar tissue relates to wet concrete. That was the first sentence. Second sentence. Or let me extend the first sentence. Let me give you a simple example of how the scar tissue relates to wet concrete, in that with wet concrete you can mold it up to a certain time. After that you can't. That would have been the first sentence. Second sentence, therapy. And that's the goal of our therapy, is to mold that scar tissue to get it back to normal or as much as your body will allow. That was the therapy sentence. Now I'm going to go into the good news, bad news, the last sentence. And so if we can align that scar tissue, that'll decrease the likelihood of you having a permanent injury. If the scar tissue heals wrong, that's when it'll be a permanent injury to some degree the rest of your life. Just like wet concrete dries to hard concrete. Those were 3 sentences. You see the concept behind it? Mm-hmm. You think it might be worth your while to memorize that. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is I found doctors that don't, they stumble through it. It takes like 20 sentences and a lot of confusion before they're done explaining a simple story.
Well, and that's where the
hold tight just a second. Hold on just a second. Okay? So that's what I would just want you to be aware of. The simplicity of the story, the importance of the story, how to deliver the story. And I would memorize it. I would write it down and I'd memorize it. I'd just memorize those 3 phrases, okay? Just kind of like so many things can be done so much more effective and simple by remembering scripts. Kind of a simple example is how to describe therapy, right? You describe therapy by saying the name of the therapy. 1 sentence is how it works, and the 3rd sentence is what is the physiological response. That's how easy it is and how quick it is. So you should be writing these down, really simple phrases, because this is unbelievably simple. But it's not when you're convoluted.